Workbenches are necessary in every workshop if you are using hand tools or power tools. Roubaud workbench is very popular among the woodworkers all around world. Roubaud was a French woodworker who lived in the 16th century. He designed this type of workbench which has not changed much and is still used by woodworkers. I want to create a similar design with the features I require for my workshop. One of the hardest things I have ever built is this. I want this bench to be heavy and stationary while I am working on it. I also want to be able to move it easily when necessary by adding these kinds of workbench casters. I want to secure the pieces I work on by installing a quick vise on one side, and I want to have dog holes for bench top clamps. Additionally, I want to install some drawers to hold the tools I use most frequently. I began by assembling the tabletop. I applied a generous amount of glue, spreading it with this paintbrush to create stronger joints. I nearly used every clamp I owned, and in order to minimize the amount of work required to straighten the top, I used this plastic mallet and small clamps to straighten the board. After letting the glue dry for a day, I took the clamps off. I made 3 of these so I could run them through the thickness planer later. Before putting them through the thickness planer, I used this scraper to clean the glue. I then straightened them and make them the same thickness by running them through the planer. I then used this method to glue all 3 together for the tabletop, which should make it straight and make the gluing process less stressful. This will save me a lot of headaches for the next step. I used a lot of clamps on this one, and after letting dry for a day I took the clamps off. I then checked to see if the top is straight. Here I used a combination square to mark the tabletop's 2 ends so I could cut them. I cut a square with the sides using a track saw, but the top is 9 cm thick and the saw could only cut 5, so I cut the remaining portion by hand. I used this router bit, which is known as a template bit, to make the cut straight. It can be used to create templates for making repetitive pieces, or it can be used to make 2 cuts straight like mine. Once the cuts were complete, I added 2 boards for each end. For these joints I used dowels. Here I marked where the dowels were located on each piece. For every joint I used 4 dowels. Next I used the combination square to mark the locations of the dowels on the boards and even the tabletop's ends. In order to drill a straight hole for the dowels, I used a drill press on the board. Off camera I also created this easy jig to ensure that the holes are straight and aligned with the boards where the dowel should be placed on the ends. After placing the jig where the dowels should be, I drilled the holes and used tape on the drill bit to get the depth I needed for the dowels. After that I applied glue to the boards and positioned the dowels. Dowels are used in joints to strengthen and straighten them. 2 reasons led me to add these boards. First, I wanted the tabletop to be 155 cm long, and the boards I purchased were 300 cm long. If I cut 155 from 300, the 145 that would be left would be wasted. So I cut the boards in half. This way the tabletop will be 155 cm long. I clamped the boards using these long clamps and let them sit for a day. To make it straight with a hand plane, I purposely left the board thicker than the tabletop. I then used wood putty to fill in the gaps, starting from the top. Flip it, then fill the gaps of the bottom of the table. After letting the putty dry, I used an orbital sander to sand the entire top. After sanding, I decided to leave the top for the time being and began work on the legs, using this 10 by 10 cm pine. I put one leg on the tabletop to measure the table's height, which varies from person to person because it depends on your personal height. The most crucial factor in achieving a height is avoiding back pain while using the table. Here I marked all 4 legs for cutting, and I used a meter saw to complete the cut. However, the meter saw was unable to complete the cut, so I used a handsaw. Since I want to add two stretches between each leg to make them more sturdy, I placed all four of them in their proper locations and measured the distance between them. I used 2x4s for the stretches, cutting them with a meter saw and using this top to ensure they were all the same length. I believe a mortise and tenon joint is strong enough for this purpose, so I used it for the stretches. I started by using a combination square and a knife to mark the tenon on the stretches. I decided to use a knife instead of pencils because I plan to use chisels for final dimensions later. To avoid errors, I also penciled in the pieces I would cut. For the tenon, I clamped two pieces of wood for repeating cuts and used a meter saw to cut most of the waste. In order to cut close to the knife walls, I also set the saw on a stove. I then used the knife walls and the chisel to clean the cuts. The cuts will be more accurate and cleaner using this technique. This is how I cut all 8 stretches. Next, I marked where the mortises were on the legs using tenons. I made the markings with a knife and a combination square. The top mortises will be flat with the top of the legs, making the tabletop flat with the legs and stretches. However, I placed the bottom mortises 10 cm above the floor, making the stretches 10 cm above the floor, allowing me to reach under the table to clean it. To cut the mortises, I used a Forstner bit on my drill press to cut most of the waste. The holes will be straight if you have a drill press, but you can also use hand drills if you don't have one. As you can see, I used the Forstner bit to cut the majority of the waste, but I still need to shape the mortises. I used the chisel to cut the sides and bottom using the knife walls. I'll show you one mortise here. I made the others the same. When I tested the joint, it was straight and fit snugly, which was more than satisfactory. Here are the bottoms of the legs. In order to avoid splits and cracks, I round over the edges. After creating the mortises and smoothing the edges, I completed all of the legs. Sanding them will be the next step to get them ready for gluing. I will tape all the tenons and mortises to label each one before gluing the joints. This will make the process easier and lessen the need to sand the joints later because all the squeezes will go on the tape, which I will remove before the glue dries. It's time to glue the joints together now. I started by making the long stretches with a lot of glue, and then I clamped them with these long clamps. After a day, I unclamped them so I could glue the shorter ones. I also took off the tapes before the glue dried, which made things easier. It was a good idea to use the tape because the joints were clean and didn't require sanding. Among its features is its stability while I work on it, and I want to be able to move the table whenever I want. This workbench caster is necessary for this feature. I purchased them on Amazon since I could not find them in my neighborhood stores. Together, the four casters can support up to 300 kg of weight. The package includes the tires as well as the wrenches and templates. They are also the additional components used to raise the tires, and they are the bolts and screws that put them together. Here I will demonstrate how to assemble one caster. I did the same with the others. When it comes to installing the casters, this template is very useful. To ensure that all of the casters were level, I taped the template to the legs and leveled them with the floor. I then marked the location of the screws and pre-drilled them, which requires 6 screws for every caster. After assembling the tire and the pedals for each caster, I tested to make sure everything was operating as it should be. You can easily move the bench when the pedals are removed because the casters will be on the floor and the legs will be above it. However, when the pedals are raised, the casters will be above the floor and the legs will be on the floor. The bench will be stable. When you work on it, it stays put. It was this table that I made as my first project when I started woodworking. This was not a workbench, it was a table saw. I spent 7 years working on this table, and everything I created was on it. However, I have not used this as a table saw since I bought one. So I did this melamine so I can use it as a workbench. It was more than just a table saw. I converted it into a router table by adding a router to it. I initially made this as a table saw so it was not sturdy enough for a workbench and had 4 regular casters underneath the legs. This bench was trembling when I used a saw or hand plane on it. Additionally, there was not enough choice for clamps to hold the pieces in place. My workshop is small, so I had to disassemble the old workbench now to make room for the new one. Even though I still have a lot of work to do on it, the new one took the place of the old one. I now return to the tabletop to complete it. To prevent splitting, I used my router to round the edges, and it looks much better. However, I have to hand sand the marks the router left behind. Here I indicated where the bench vise should be placed on the tabletop and along this stretch. I want to add a quick vise here, and I used a router to make the groove so that the vise will be flat on both the top and the sides. After that, I used the router to locate the vise by taking the top off one side. However, I added this MDF to the router base to make the groove even, because it was larger than the base. After the router, I flattened the groove and squared it with the knife walls using a chisel. In this way, the vise will fit well. I used screws to install the vise, but first I pre-drilled the screws holes to ensure that the vise would be flat with the tabletop. I installed it using 4 large screws and added washers underneath as shims. Although it was preferable to leave the front stretch uncut, I used a circular saw to cut it because the vise wouldn't sit. I hope it has no effect on the table's strength. I positioned the tabletop to see if it sits properly after setting up the vise and cutting the front stretch. It is now time to attach the legs to the top. To keep the bottom from moving while being assembled, I clamped it with stretches. In order for the screws to reach the tabletop, I first drilled half of the stretch with this bit. Next, I used a different bit to make the screws locations. Because they are very heavy together, I wanted to remove the top and move them separately if I needed to move the table in future. For this reason, I used screws. Dog holes for benchtop clamps are another feature of this workbench. Here I used a pencil to indicate where the holes were. I wanted to leave 10 cm between each hole. So I started in the center of the quick vise and worked my way up to the end of the table. The crosses would be the locations of the holes, which I marked with this tool after I finished drawing the lines using this ruler. The dog holes must be 20 cm in diameter. I have this set of long beads and I used 20 cm for the holes, which is sufficient to pass through the table from top to bottom. And I used this drill stand so the clamps will function correctly and the holes will be straight. I have to clamp the drill stand to the table for every hole to prevent it from moving. In order to prevent splits and cracks, I use the stand stop to prevent the bit from going all the way down. This way I could use this bit, which is the same size, to finish the hole on bottom. There are 60 holes in all. This is how I made each one. And finally I rounded over the hole's head. And I have this wood. I am not sure what kind it is, but it's sturdy and hard. I use it for the quick vise here. I started by drilling the screw holes and then countersinking them. After that I fastened them with bolts on one side and screws on the other side. I have completed the workbench, so it is ready for use. However, I wanted to increase storage by adding drawers inside. The drawer boxes bases will be made of this plywood. In order for the base to sit on the bottom stretches, I cut these ends to fit in the legs. Then I used my table saw to cut the remaining box pieces. I used screws for the boxes assembly. Before screwing, I clamped and squared the sides with the base, because the sides of boxes drawers should be square with the top and base. I put one side together here, then turn it over and put the other side together. I put the middle wall together here. It should be in the middle so that the width of all four drawers is the same. This one is the back and this one will be the top of the box. In order to ensure that all of the box's sides are screwed to the stretches, I added 4 stretch using pocket holes. I placed the box in its proper location. As you can see, I intentionally left space for the shop vacuum by not making the box for the whole bench. Since I frequently use vacuums, I wanted to be able to close to the bench. Additionally, because it is easier to reach the top of the box for cleaning and because I will be using clamps on the bench top, I didn't construct the box until the upper stretches. I screwed the box with the stretches after placing it in its final spot. I will start working on the drawer now. I use this kind of slide. I always use this tip to measure the drawers. After placing both slides and 2 pieces of the identical plywood that I will be using for the drawer sides, I will measure the width to determine how wide the drawers will be. I measure for one drawer because I put the middle wall together precisely in the middle of the box. The measurements will be the same for the other drawers. Here I used my table saw and meter saw to cut the drawer sides. I also used 8 cm plywood for the drawer bases. Here I groove where the bases are. Since this method, in my opinion, is far stronger than using screws, I can store anything inside the drawers without worrying about the base coming loose. This is how I intended the base to sit. It fits, but it also slides. I clamped the drawer first, then used a ruler and 2 pieces of wood clamped together to measure the base precisely. This tip, in my opinion, is more accurate than merely using a tape measure. Additionally, I used a table saw and meter saw to cut the base. There are so many ways for assembling the drawers. I assembled them using glue and pocket holes, which should be sturdy enough. I assembled it using pocket holes after sliding the base into the grooves and applying glue to the sides. This pin allows you to divide the 2 sections of this slide, one to the side of the box and one to the side of the drawer. I started by assembling the one that attached to the box side. In order for the drawers to flush with the front of the box, I used this plywood as a space for the box's base and flushed the front with the wall before screwing them in place. I then put the other part on the drawer side together. I flushed the drawer's front with the slide's front. I then put the drawer in place to check the fit. That's how I made all 4 drawers. For the drawer faces, I used the same plywood. I started by using my table saw to cut all 4. Since the drawers' faces will be flat with the bench's front, I didn't want to use the handles because I occasionally clamp large boards to the bench's front to work on them, and handles will interfere with that. Instead, I chose to drill holes for the handles. I used a drill press to make the holes first, and then a router to round them. I had to hand sand the edges because the round over bit had burned them. The holes made it easier for me to install the faces. I clamped the faces to the drawer front using them and used playing cards to create even gaps between the drawers. I used this little clamp to clamp the face, then slowly slide the drawer to screw it with larger clamps. And finally, I used screws to put the face together. I completed the drawers. It is time to finish the workbench now. Since there will be cracks and stains on the table, I don't think workbenches need to be finished. However, since I had this oil, I chose to finish it. This bench took longer than I anticipated and it's expensive, particularly now that wood and accessories are so expensive. But I have been wanting to create a workbench like this for a while, and it will be very useful for what I do. Finally, I would like to show you the workbench features. When you lift the pedal on these casters, for instance, the tires will be elevated and the legs will remain on the ground. This is crucial for working on the workbench because it keeps it stationary. However, the entire workbench will be on casters once the pedals are depressed, allowing for movement. This is crucial for me because it allows me to shoot more angles for my videos. And these are hold fast clamps. I purchased two. To clamp the pieces, you will insert them into the holes. They fit precisely and clamp firmly without shifting. Additionally, these are bench dog clamps, which are positioned slightly above the workbench surface to avoid getting in the way of planing or sanding thinner materials. Position the dog hold clamps on a bench, turn the stainless steel top bar with an 8 mm ratchet wrench and manually hold strength to make a stable non-slip surface for working with various types of wood. And this is the quick release vise. With the aid of bench dog clamps, you can move this metal piece to clamp anything. Additionally, you can clamp any wood to work on it by placing it inside the vise. Because of its quick release mechanism, clamping with one hand is made easier. These are the drawers I added to the workbench, where I kept the tools I use most frequently, the bench clamps and the accessories for my cameras. My tiny workshop needs more storage, so I need these drawers. This is the final result. I hope you enjoy it. I appreciate you staying to the very end.